The next most important characteristic to discuss is the handgun trigger. Handgun triggers are measured in 3 ways: trigger staging, trigger pull weight, and trigger pull length. The trigger and the trigger assembly is a handgun's most complicated mechanism, and it's a mechanism that has a huge impact on your ability to use that handgun effectively and efficiently and comfortably. The higher quality guns out there with better triggers will have the following characteristics. First, what's known as a 2-stage trigger. Second, a short trigger pull length. And third, a moderate to light trigger pull weight. Lesser quality guns will have the following characteristics that we want to avoid. And these are all at the other end of the spectrum for each of those 3 categories. First, what's known as a single stage trigger. Second, they'll have long trigger pull lengths. And third, they'll have heavy trigger pull weights. Now, you can feel a big difference between these 2 kinds and these 2 qualities of triggers. One of them feels squishy, and you've got to pull it back a long ways before the firing pin is released. And after it's released, you've got to let it up a long ways before you can begin pulling the trigger again to make another shot go off. On the other hand, the other trigger feels crisp, and it feels consistent, and it has a much shorter travel length in both directions. We say the first group of characteristics is better because handguns with triggers in those configurations are easier to fire accurately and can be fired more accurately with greater speed than the others. And they're more comfortable for your trigger finger to operate than those triggers that fit into the second group of characteristics. Here's why that's the case. Many self-defense revolvers and even many lower quality self-defense handguns have very heavy trigger pull weights. For example, the trigger pull on a handgun like this could easily exceed 6 pounds, sometimes up to 10 or 12, or in some cases even 15 pounds. Now, why is that such a big disadvantage? Well, think about this. This handgun here weighs far less than 1 pound, probably just a little over half a pound. And so if you've got a 6 or a 7 or 8 pound trigger on this, just think about the physics of this. So you're holding on to something that weighs half a pound and you're exerting 12 times that much force on the trigger. All the while, you've got to keep that weapon steady, pointed at the target. Well, it's very hard to do. Ideally, you would have a 12-pound gun with a 1-pound trigger. That's how you shoot precision. If you've got a 1-pound gun with a 12-pound trigger, that is going to be very, very difficult for you to fire accurately, and that's why semi-automatic tier 2, very small guns with single-stage heavy triggers, and that's why J-frame revolvers with very, very stiff triggers are so difficult to fire accurately. And right there alongside trigger press weight, where the heavier your trigger pull becomes, the less accurate you can be with that gun, we have trigger press length. And so the lowest quality triggers are going to have a long trigger pull length. And you can see this is an unloaded handgun. There's no magazine, there's nothing in the chamber. But the length on this trigger press is quite long. So we start here, goes all the way back, and finally it fires. Why is that a bad thing? Well, that whole distance is a distance where you have to apply that heavy pressure to a very lightweight handgun. What that translates to is a lot of potential for shaking off your target. And remember, it only takes a little tiny bit of barrel wiggle to throw your accuracy off big time. Conversely, the highest quality triggers, such as on this 1911 Dan Wesson Guardian, it's almost $2,000 handgun. There's no magazine, there's nothing in the chamber. The trigger press length on this is very short, and the trigger press weight is very light. That has a huge impact on how accurate you can be with that handgun. Now, of course, there are 3 factors. trigger pull weight, trigger pull length, and the trigger staging configuration. Is that weapon equipped with a single stage trigger or a two-stage trigger? Well, I've explained this just about as well as I can on another piece of Concealed Carry University curriculum called Master Handgun Accuracy. And even though that's a program that I think you could probably benefit from big time, I want to actually pull the chapter from Master Accuracy on trigger staging in and show you that chapter right now. That's going to explain what trigger staging is and how it works and why it's such a critical factor in selecting a handgun. A very important consideration with the way that you personally will be executing your trigger pull has to do with this trigger staging that I mentioned. Since this will play such a critical role in the way that you personally shoot your own handgun, let's spend another moment reviewing the different scenarios and the different types of triggers out there. The first and most ideal scenario is that you'll have a high quality tier 1 handgun with a two-stage trigger. This means that there are two different sections of the trigger pull with two different weights. There's a long first stage, which is the taking up of the slack, and then there's the point where the second stage begins. This is where the squishy first stage noticeably stiffens, and after a very short amount of travel, the trigger then feels as though it's coming up against a wall. When it's at this wall, the two-stage trigger has only a very short amount of travel remaining before the firing mechanism is released and the shot breaks. The way two-stage triggers feel will vary based on manufacturer. Some handguns, such as the Springfield XD line, have, in my opinion, a very nice, crisp, and clean trigger pull. The gun I carry, a Glock, has a very different trigger pull. Even though both are two-stage, it does take some getting used to when you switch back and forth. And that's why developing your muscle memory for your specific handgun is so important. The way to properly use a two-stage trigger is to depress the trigger quickly and rapidly through the first stage, and then slow down a touch as you move through the second stage, and then come to a stop as the trigger hits this wall that indicates that the gun is about to go off if you push a little further. This is where you pause and make sure you're still lined up for the perfect shot. Now, in the beginning, this pause may be a full second or two. However, the goal that you are working on and building toward is that this pause is only going to last a fraction of a second. In fact, to the outside bystander who's watching you shoot, it may not even appear that there was any pause at all. Granted, in some rapid fire situations, you'll certainly be pulling the trigger as fast as you possibly can. But in every other situation, regardless of how quickly you're firing your gun, you'll most likely be pausing at this second stage very briefly to allow the gun to recover from any barrel wobble or wiggle that may have occurred throughout the first stage of the trigger pull. And then after the shot breaks, you'll reset the trigger. This means that you will not let your finger come all the way off the trigger. The first stage should only ever be used when you're taking your very first shot. After that, you only need to let a two-stage trigger up through that wall that we keep mentioning. The moment you do, you'll feel and hear the firing mechanism click back into place and ready itself for the next shot. From here, you need only to press the trigger through that wall to fire the next shot. And this short trigger travel is what makes a two-stage trigger so much more inherently accurate than a single-stage trigger, and it allows for faster rapid fire as well. Now, while I do not do this trigger reset practice in the dry fire training portion of this program on Disc 2, you can actually incorporate trigger resets into your dry fire practice on your own with a single action or striker fired pistol like this Glock. All you have to do is hold the trigger all the way back after the dry fire shot breaks. and then cycle the action while still holding the trigger all the way back. And then once the action is cycled, you can let up on the trigger slowly to find that point of reset. And then you can continue your dry fire practice. Doing this will allow you to leverage the mechanical advantages of your fine pistol to the max. The next most common sort of trigger is referred to as a single stage trigger. These types of triggers are found on less expensive or smaller pistols because they are mechanically simpler devices. They don't take up as much room inside the gun, and they're cheaper to manufacture. A single stage trigger is not as inherently accurate as a two-stage trigger, but with practice you can become nearly as good with a single stage triggered gun as you can with a pistol with 2 stages in its trigger. Rather than having the varying pressures or the wall of a 2-stage trigger, a single stage trigger has roughly the same weight from beginning to end. Some single stage triggers will get heavier and heavier the further they pull back, but that's not always the case. The wall that defines a 2-stage trigger is not present in a single stage trigger, although there usually is some sort of subtle mechanical indication that the trigger press is nearly at an end. And you'll find and become aware of that subtle indication as you get to know your gun good enough. Single stage triggers also lack the short distance trigger reset that you find in a 2-stage trigger. While you can feel the trigger reset when letting off the trigger following a shot, the trigger reset in a single stage trigger often doesn't happen until the trigger has been almost completely released. And since you have to essentially pull the trigger all the way from beginning to end every single time, this is why guns with single stage triggers are difficult to fire rapidly and accurately. Again, good accuracy is possible with a single stage trigger. It just simply takes more time and more muscle memory practice to get there. Self-defense revolvers often have some of the stiffest triggers that you're going to find on a defensive carry gun. They also often have lengthy trigger pulls. For these reasons, it's easy for your trigger finger to become sore and exhausted with just a little bit of practice with your revolver. Add in the extremely snappy recoil, even for a comparatively light cartridge like the .38 Special, and J-frame revolvers can quickly become one of the most difficult pistols to fire accurately. The key to getting good with a J-frame revolver is trigger mastery through developing muscle memory. It's far more important to master the trigger of a J-frame than it is to master one of a nice Tier 1 semi-auto pistol, because in part, these guns have very small handles, which allows for very little support against the hefty trigger pull. Which means that even if these guns had beautiful triggers, their small size and the mechanical work that the trigger is doing on a J-frame would make them harder to shoot. What I mean is, in addition to releasing a firing pin, the trigger on a double action J-frame revolver is actually pulling back a very heavy hammer, whether that is either internal or external, while rotating the cylinder to bring up the next cartridge for firing. Your job then is to mentally separate these two tasks. You've got to separate the work from releasing the hammer, which will fire the shot. So the first 98% of the trigger press is mechanical work. You're lifting that hammer back and you're rotating that cylinder. So you've got to ingrain it into your muscle memory to stop and to take the same pause that you would take for completing the trigger pull on a 2-stage semi-auto after you've done that 98% of the trigger press, the mechanical work portion. Pause and make sure you're aligned for the perfect shot, and then complete the final 2% of the trigger pull, which is doing nothing more than dropping the hammer. If you can work this into your muscle memory, you'll be able to achieve a decent level of accuracy with these small handguns. Once you get down this basic concept, your goal is going to be to complete each trigger pull as fast as possible while still maintaining that smooth, fluid motion. You should be able to go from finger along the frame of the revolver to completing the first 98% of that trigger pull and doing all that mechanical work in the blink of an eye, and then pausing and completing the trigger press in a relaxed, smooth manner. It takes practice, but that's what developing effective muscle memory is all about. What you'll find as you go deeper and deeper into the handgun space is that expensive Tier 1 combat quality handguns, such as those carried by police officers in the line of duty or carried by soldiers or military personnel into battle. These more expensive combat grade handguns are always going to have the higher quality triggers with the preferred characteristics in each of those three categories: trigger pull weight, length, and trigger staging configuration. Now, the only downside to these is that they're expensive to manufacture and they take up more space. And so it's the bigger guns that usually have these. When you look at the smaller guns like the Ruger LCP that are manufactured specifically for concealed carry and marketed specifically to those of private citizens who just want to be able to carry a gun, almost always they'll have sacrificed on the trigger. They'll have gone with a trigger configuration that's more inexpensive to manufacture, and because they simply don't have a lot of space to work with, because they want a gun that's going to appeal to the most people, a gun that's easy to carry, they're going to have gone with a very inexpensive and therefore, not preferred trigger mechanism. And so here again we come to a big dilemma, or a big paradox, or a big series of compromises that we have to make when choosing a concealed handgun. Do we go with a bigger, higher quality trigger that we can shoot accurately, which will require us to get used to carrying a slightly bigger handgun concealed? Or do we go with a smaller handgun that's easier to carry concealed while accepting the disadvantages that come with a more inexpensive and smaller packaged trigger, like the single stage trigger? It's a decision only you can make. Just remember, we armed citizens depend on accuracy. Our concealed handguns aren't going to do us much good if we can't land hits on target quickly. They're just not going to do us a lot of good. And so we have to be able to fire our handguns accurately. Now, even a Ruger LCP, you can learn to shoot these handguns very well if you're willing to put in all the time necessary to do that. However, that time is always going to be better invested with a higher quality trigger, because these handguns have what I refer to as a greater inherent accuracy ability than a weapon like this. If you have somebody with a level 10 skill going into an LCP, they're still going to be limited by the bottleneck that is the trigger on this weapon. Whereas if you have somebody with a 7 level skill going into a high quality combat grade weapon like this, they may be able to shoot even better than the more skilled person. A trigger is that important. So make this decision very responsibly and in being aware of what you're giving up when you make those sacrifices.